Welcome to today's creepy bedtime stories. We have another 5 stories that will give you goosebumps and send the shivers down your spine. Today's titles are The Painting, The Guest, The Old Hospital, The Forest Cabin, and the last one, The Haunted Dollhouse. Okay, then let's start dozing off into a deep sleep. But don't forget to like and subscribe before you fall asleep. The first story is called The Painting. When my aunt passed away, she left me a beautiful, old painting that had been in our family for 4 generations. It depicted a serene landscape, with rolling hills and a lone, gnarled tree in the foreground. The sky was painted in hues of red and orange, giving it a slightly ominous feel. I hung it in my living room, appreciating its antique charm. A few nights after that I hung the painting, I began to notice changes in the painting. At first, it was subtle, the colours seemed darker, and the tree looked more twisted. I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me. But over the next few days, the changes became more pronounced. The sky grew darker, almost stormy, and the tree now had something hanging from its branches. One night, I was awoken by a loud crash. I ran to the living room and found the painting on the floor, the glass shattered. As I picked it up, I noticed the figure hanging from the tree. It was a woman, her face twisted in agony. Her dress was torn, and her eyes seemed to be staring directly at me. Terrified, I decided to put the painting in the attic. But even then, I couldn't escape it. I started having vivid nightmares of the woman, hearing her cries for help. One night, I dreamt I was in the painting, standing beneath the tree. The woman reached out to me, her cold hands gripping my wrists. "Help me," she whispered, her voice full of despair. I woke up drenched in sweat, convinced that the painting was cursed. The next day I called an art historian to see if he could shed some light on its origins of the painting. He came to my house, examined the painting, and went pale. He told me the painting was created by a deranged artist who believed he could trap souls within his work. The story among fellow historians goes that the woman in the painting is his wife, whom he had murdered by hanging her from a tree branch, and then painting the painting as she hung there hopelessly crying for help. Desperate to free myself from the painting's curse, I decided to burn it. I took it to the backyard, doused it in gasoline, and set it on fire. As the flames consumed the canvas, I heard a blood-curdling scream. The painting burned to ashes, but the scream echoed in my ears long after I burned the painting that my aunt left me. I hoped I was free after burning the painting, but the nightmares haven't ever stopped. Every night, I see the woman's face, her eyes looking for me, trying to look me in the eye. I fear that by destroying the painting, I have unleashed her spirit, and because of this, she would never leave me alone ever again. The next story is about a small, family-run B&B in a quiet town that is being visited by strange guests. I work at a small, family-run bed and breakfast in a quiet town. One winter evening, a man checked in, looking tired and worn. He gave his name as Mr. Gray and requested a room for the night. He was polite but distant, and there was something about him that made me uneasy. That night, I heard strange noises coming from Mr. Gray's room. It sounded like whispers and soft cries. I went to check on him, but when I knocked on his door, there was no answer. I used the master key to open the door, but what I saw chilled me to the bone. Mr. Gray was sitting in the middle of the room, surrounded by candles. He was chanting in a language I didn't understand, and there was a dark, shadowy figure standing behind him. The figure had glowing red eyes and seemed to be whispering in Mr. Gray's ear. I backed out of the room, my heart racing, and locked the door behind me. I called the police, but when they arrived, the room was empty. There were no candles, no signs of Mr. Gray, and no trace of the shadowy figure. The only thing left was a strange symbol drawn on the floor. The police couldn't explain it, and Mr. Gray was never seen again. But that night was just the beginning. Strange things started happening in the bed and breakfast. Guests reported hearing whispers and seeing shadowy figures. Objects moved on their own, and doors slammed shut without warning. One night, I found the symbol from Mr. Gray's room drawn on the floor of the lobby. As I stood there, staring at it, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned around to see Mr. Gray, his eyes empty and lifeless. "Help me," he whispered, before disappearing into the shadows. I realized that whatever ritual Mr. Gray had performed had opened a door to something dark and sinister. Now, the bed and breakfast is haunted by restless spirits. And for me, I am trapped here, unable to escape their torment. The next story is about how I started my internship at an old, abandoned hospital that was being renovated into a community centre. My job was to document the process, taking photos and notes of the progress. The hospital itself had a dark history, with many patients having died there under mysterious circumstances. On my first day, I felt an eerie presence as soon as I walked in. The air was heavy, and the halls were dimly lit, even during the day. As I explored the building, I found myself drawn to the basement. It was cold and damp, with a musty smell that made me nauseous. As I walked through the basement, I heard faint whispers and saw shadows moving in the corners of my eyes. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, and continued with my work. In one of the old storage rooms, I found a dusty box filled with patient records. I opened it and started reading through them, horrified by what I found. The records detailed experiments that had been conducted on the patients, with many of them subjected to inhumane treatments. The doctors had been trying to find a cure for a mysterious illness, but their methods were cruel and unethical. Many patients had died as a result of these experiments, their spirits trapped within the hospital. As I read through the records, I felt a cold breeze and heard a loud bang. I looked up to see the door slam shut, trapping me inside. The whispers grew louder, and I saw ghostly figures emerging from the walls. They were the patients, their faces twisted in pain and anger. One of them, a young woman, stepped forward. Her eyes were filled with sadness, and she reached out to me. "Help us," she whispered, "set us free." Terrified, I promised to help them and searched for a way to escape. I found an old key in the corner of the room and used it to unlock the door. I ran out of the basement and out of the hospital, vowing never to return. The next day I contacted a paranormal investigator, and together we performed a ritual to release the trapped spirits. As we chanted, the hospital shook, and the ghostly figures appeared once more. They looked at us with gratitude before disappearing into the light. The hospital is now a community centre, but I will never forget the horrors I witnessed there. The spirits may be at peace, but their pain and suffering will haunt me forever. The next story is about me and my family visiting a wooden cabin in the forest, something we do annually. Every summer, my family and I would visit a remote cabin in the woods. It was a peaceful retreat, far from the hustle and bustle of city life. But one summer, things took a dark turn. On the first night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. I looked out the window and saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the light of our porch. It was too dark to make out any details, but the figure stood still, watching the cabin. The next day, I found strange symbols carved into the trees around the cabin. They looked like ancient runes, and they made me feel uneasy. My parents brushed it off as teenagers playing pranks, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, the footsteps came again, closer this time. I heard whispering outside my window, but when I looked out, there was no one there. The symbols on the trees seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. On the third night, I woke up to find the figure standing on our porch, looking in through the window. It was a tall, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. I screamed, waking my parents. When they came into my room, the figure was gone. We decided to leave the cabin early, but as we packed up, we found more symbols carved into the walls and doors. The air was thick with a sense of dread, and we could hear whispers all around us. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin and saw the figure standing in the doorway, watching us leave. The whispers followed us all the way home, and I knew we had disturbed something ancient and evil. To this day, I have nightmares about that cabin. I see the symbols and hear the whispers, and I know the figure is still out there, waiting for us to return. We never went back to the cabin, but the fear and unease have stayed with me, a constant reminder of the darkness lurking in the woods. The last story is about my younger sister and the haunted dollhouse. As a child, my little sister was fascinated by dollhouses. Our grandmother gave her a beautiful, antique dollhouse for her birthday, complete with tiny furniture and porcelain dolls. She spent hours playing with it, creating stories and adventures for her miniature family. One day, she noticed something strange. The dolls seemed to move on their own. She would arrange them in one room, only to find them in a different room the next day. She thought that it was me, playing a prank on her, but I denied it, and the movements continued. One night, she woke up to the sound of tiny footsteps. She looked over at the dollhouse and saw the dolls moving. They were walking around, interacting with each other as if they were alive. She rubbed her eyes, thinking she was dreaming, but the dolls continued to move. She told our parents, but they didn't believe her. They thought she had an overactive imagination. But the doll's movements became more frequent and more unsettling. She started hearing whispers coming from the dollhouse, and sometimes she would catch glimpses of the dolls' faces turning to look at her. One evening, she decided to investigate. She carefully moved the dolls and furniture, looking for any hidden mechanisms or explanations. As she was examining the dollhouse, she found a hidden compartment in the attic. Inside was a small, leather-bound book. It was a diary, written by the original owner of the dollhouse. The diary detailed the life of a little girl, Emily, who had owned the dollhouse over a century ago. She wrote about how she loved her dolls and how they kept her company. But as she read further, the entries grew darker. Emily wrote about how the dolls started to move on their own, whispering to her at night. She became terrified of them, but they wouldn't leave her alone. The final entry was chilling. Emily wrote that the dolls had told her they needed a new home, and she was going to help them find one. She disappeared shortly after, and the dollhouse was passed down through generations until it reached my little sister. She realized the dolls were haunted by Emily's spirit, and they were looking for a new child to possess. Terrified, she locked the dollhouse in the attic and refused to go near it again. But the whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. One night, she woke up to find the dollhouse back in her room, the dolls arranged in a circle, staring at her. Their eyes seemed to glow with a malevolent light, and she knew they wouldn't stop until they had her. She gathered all her courage and took the dollhouse to the backyard. She doused it in gasoline and set it on fire, watching as the flames consumed it. The dolls' faces seemed to twist in agony, and she heard a high-pitched scream as the dollhouse burned to ashes. After the dollhouse burned to ashes, the whispers stopped, and my little sister felt a sense of relief. But sometimes, in the dead of night, she hears faint footsteps and wonders if the dolls have found a new home. Thank you for listening to this episode of Bedtime 5 Creepy Stories. If you haven't drifted off into a deep sleep yet, then please don't forget to like and subscribe.